Having car problems? Well, with Rhoda, getting them fixed is as easy as ordering takeout. They'll come pick up your car for free, do any repair or maintenance needed, and return it right to your driveway. They'll even give you a complimentary video inspection of your car so you can see what needs to be done. Perfect for those of us that maybe aren't so car savvy. Book your appointment online at roda.com. And lucky for you, CityCast listeners get a 20% discount on any service for up to $100 off. Just use the code CityCast20.
Today on CityCast DC, federal workers make up about a quarter of the jobs in DC. And these days they're worried. The incoming Trump administration's talk of slashing the government and changing the rules around career public servants would be a huge economic and cultural change for our city. The Washington Post's Lisa.rein covers the federal workforce, and she's here to talk us through what may be coming down the pike and what the options are for Washingtonians who might find themselves in the crosshairs. Today is Monday, January 13th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hi, Lisa.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So there is so much anxiety going on, in my neighborhood, probably in your neighborhood, and everyone's neighborhood in DC, about President-elect Donald Trump's promises to significantly shrink government. He has threatened to fire thousands of people. How are career civil servants reacting?
Well, I think that a lot of people are worried about what will happen to their jobs. They also don't know exactly what the Trump team is going to do with the government. All they really have to go on is what Trump and his allies, in particular Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are heading up this sort of unelected commission called the Department of Government Efficiency. And those guys have said a lot of pretty hyperbolic things about cutting government, cutting the workforce. I don't think that it's going to be possible to do everything at the level that they're talking about. But I do think that, the Trump team will try some things, and a lot of things will end up in court. So that's not a lot of fun if you're a dedicated public servant.
So as I understand it, some public servants have sort of responded to this by kind of trying to lay low, like scrubbing their social media, that sort of thing. How are people doing that?
That's right. So in Trump's first term, I think that the Trump officials kind of had the same goals, but they really weren't as experienced in government and in running government agencies. And then also, Trump was not bent on personal retribution against federal employees he felt had really wronged him with a variety of investigations. So right now, what's happening is that I think at this point, employees are saying, okay, I want to keep working in government. And so I want to kind of make sure that I'm not a target. So a lot of people at agencies across the government are scrubbing their social media accounts, Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, any social media really, of comments that they may have made against the Trump administration or against Donald Trump, which they can do in their private capacities. It's not illegal to do that, but they have tried to scrub any appearance of bias against Trump that might draw attention to them.
Well, right, because one of the things of Washington is, a lot of our neighbors are public servants. And for people who are career public servants, the rule is, obviously you have to work for the people you work for, but when you're a private citizen, you have the same rights as any other private citizen. You can be involved in your church. You can be involved in a political party. You can do whatever it is you're going to do, and you can't get fired for it. So why are they worried that understanding may change now?
What we've actually seen along the lines of what you're talking about is that Elon Musk, for example, has targeted specific employees on X whose jobs deal with fighting climate change. And there's another man named Tom Jones who's out there who's funded by the Heritage Foundation. We don't know exactly what will happen with his work, but he's got a website that identifies high-level employees, for example, the Justice Department, at the Department of Homeland Security, and who he claims have liberal biases. But your question, Michael, is really the key one, which is what can this administration do to these employees who it perceives are going to resist the Trump agenda? What they believe they saw last time around was certain employees who resisted what they wanted to do and who called them out on it and who were eventually sidelined. And so I think we don't know exactly what the new administration plans to do, but I think that the biggest policy change that is hanging over these employees is called Schedule F, and it's a change that Trump implemented in the very last weeks of his first term that would have made certain employees, could be 100,000, could have been 50,000, in policy roles, put them in a different occupational category that basically would have taken away a lot of the rights to due process that civil servants have. And this never was implemented, although the Office of Management and Budget did come up with a list of employees, and it, I think, amounted to about 90% of OMB employees, which is pretty scary. But the idea is that employees would be put into this category and they would not be immediately fired. I think a lot of people have an understanding that I think is wrong in that case. But they would essentially be intimidated if they were in this category and they did something that basically angered the head of the cabinet, their bosses. They could be fired with very little due process. And that's really scary. So they don't want to be targeted.
Right. So there are parts of the government already, like the Foreign Service, where they work at the pleasure of the president. But that is the minority of the federal government. What you're saying is these guys want to really expand the number of people who, one way or the other, don't have what we associate with typical civil servant protections.
That's right. And there are various categories of employees, and these employees have various degrees of protections. But by and large, with the exception of some employees, if you are not a political appointee, and these are the people who come in and out, in every administration, that's one of the great benefits of working in government is that you have rights to due process. And essentially what the Trump people are saying is, well, we believe that a lot of these, what they are terming unelected bureaucrats, which is a very derisive term for who they believe are people who work in the civil service, but who last time around did not carry out the administration's agenda, should be put on notice. And what we don't know, Michael, is how the Trump administration is going to revive Schedule F. It's believed that they will do it, but we're not sure when and how. And the other thing they have to contend with is that President Biden issued a regulation actually this year to kind of Trump-proof the workforce. So they issued this regulation that essentially more or less says, okay, you can't put people in this new employment category. And if you do, they're protected. It will take some work for the Trump people to basically get rid of the Biden regulation, but we just don't know how they're going to do it.
So one of the things this changes is, look, people, public servants, particularly more senior folks who do deal with policy, they take a pride, in my experience, in being dispassionate servants of their country. And this notion of Schedule F and stuff might make them feel more like you are being treated as lackeys or yes men or whatever. And whether or not it leads to people being fired, it really sort of changes the meaning of work. And I think the kind of sense of identity people get out of their work.
Yeah, you're right.
And one of the things you've written about is how some folks are already throwing in the towel, looking at what's likely to come and thinking, I'm too old for this. I'm getting out. I'm going to do something else.
That's right. What we see now, and it's very anecdotal because we're not going to really have data on the number of people who have either quit or retired for several months. It just takes a while to catch up. But anecdotally, we're hearing that particularly at the Justice Department, at the Office of Management and Budget. These are agencies that really kind of have become agencies on the firing line for Trump. Other agencies like the EPA, which has a mission to fight climate change, preserve the environment. Some of these agencies will change their missions in the new administration. And a lot of these people, as you said, are throwing in the towel and they're saying, look, I'm not sure I want to go through an administration where I could be targeted. But what the issue you raised, Michael, is, I think, a sort of a subtle difference. It's true that public servants, they are nonpartisan. And when a new administration comes in, their mission is to follow the agenda of the new administration. No question. Perception, though, of the Trump team is that there was a lot of resistance in the initial Trump administration among many employees to doing this.
That's not how they saw it. They saw it as we were just trying to follow the law, and they were asking us to do things that were improper.
So the civil servants felt, as you said, that a lot of times what they were asked to do was not legal. For example, the civil servants, the high-ranking officials at the Office of Management and Budget, felt that they were asked to withhold aid to Ukraine, for example, because the president in his first term wanted the president of Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden's son. And so that was a question really of civil servants taking a stance that what they were being asked to do was not legal. And it was something that the president was asking them to do for his personal benefit. That's very different than just being asked to carry out the agenda of a president, which may be, again, a conservative agenda. So there are differences here. I do think, though, that there were, in the first term, many employees who, have more liberal politics, who didn't want the EPA, for example, to stop doing inspections and pursuing clean energy projects and clean air and clean water. At the same time, there are many conservatives who work in government, for example, at many, many law enforcement agencies, at TSA, who work for DHS, who work on the border, and they were very happy to carry out the agenda. So there's just a lot of things in the mix in terms of how civil servants sort of see their jobs and saw their jobs in the Trump administration.
They've also talked about moving large numbers of government jobs elsewhere.
Sure.
Which would obviously have a big effect on the city's economy. For employees, being told that you either move to Kansas City or you're fired is a pretty tough choice. What options do employees have in that kind of situation? It's different from being fired.
That's right. So the administration tried this, I would say, only with a modicum of success in the first term, where they moved an agency at the Agriculture Department that did economic research out to Kansas City, and an Interior Department, Bureau of Land Management, out to Grand Junction, Colorado. First of all, these moves cost millions of dollars, and that's an interesting consideration, given that this administration says that its main goal is to cut the size of government. Also, a lot of people quit, and these agencies have been pretty much hollowed out. I mean, in part, I think that
might have been the goal.
The goal of the administration. They talked about doing this with the EPA. A lot of people would just quit. On the other hand, many employees of federal agencies do work outside of Washington. I think people may not be aware that 85% of the civil service, which has about 2.3 million people, is outside of D.C. So it just appears that D.C. has maybe 350 or more thousand federal employees right here. And obviously DC is not that big a city, so it becomes they're a big part of DC. But it's not an easy thing to move an agency out of DC. And it might get the administration what it wants, in the sense that it would really dilute the mission. It would also, they would lose a lot of experts. And that's, both good for this administration, maybe not as good for future administrations.
But if you're told, your job as of next September will be in Minneapolis, you just out of luck if you don't want to go there?
That's right. I mean, they would pay your relocation costs, but I'm not actually sure if that person who would decide to leave would get some compensation? And this is a question I need to figure out.
When it's cold outside, there is nothing better than a warmly lit restaurant and a cozy 3-course meal. And Winter Restaurant Week makes that actually accessible. It's happening this year from Monday, January 27th through Sunday, February 2nd. There are more than 250 participating restaurants this year, spanning over 70 different cuisines. So I love going to Restaurant Week because it's a chance to try out places that otherwise might be a little out of my budget. And there's something both fancy and relaxing about sitting down to a meal where you just pick from a curated menu at the start and then just let the courses come to you. Participating restaurants are offering brunch and lunch for either $25 or $35 per person. Dinners range from $40 to $65. Some spots even have drink pairings, which is very much right up my alley. Visit rwdmv.com to see restaurant menus and make reservations. Metropolitan Washington Restaurant Week is presented by the Restaurant Association, Metropolitan Washington, and Events DC.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
So one of the gobsmacking reports I've seen, I think you did, was about civil servants taking out liability insurance to cover legal fees if they're demoted or fired or have to fight something.
That's right. So
I've never heard anything like that before. Yeah. It's amazing.
Well, I think this has happened in the past, and it probably happened more in the first Trump administration, and it's happening more now. Again, we don't have numbers, but there are so many what we call sort of adverse actions that happen in general, whatever the administration is, and employees hire lawyers and they try to fight these things. I think that what we just don't know is really, what rights employees will have to fight any adverse actions against them. And these fights could take years, and it's really extremely costly for federal employees, and it takes forever. And who wants to go through that? It's not fun. But I just think we don't really know at this point what the Trump team will do. It's fine for Vivek Ramaswamy to say they're going to just fire federal employees. I don't think that's going to happen en masse. I really don't, for a variety of reasons.
So it seems to me there's been kind of two ways of people thinking about this. There's one view that you hear from a lot of sort of people who've been experienced covering government politics who say basically like, Sonny, I've seen people like this come and go before. Washington's going to chew them up and spit them out. And then another group that say, no, actually, this administration, and I think this current budget showdown maybe underlines this, that there are a bunch of real radicals in here who actually are not going to be dissuaded by some of the things, including courts and stuff, that slowed down previous enthusiasts for getting control of the federal budget. What's your view, or the view of the people you trust and listen to about how real some of the more catastrophic scenarios are?
Sure. These are really good questions to be asking. And I think there's no question that Trump and his allies and the people coming into his cabinet, as well as these tech moguls who are playing a really outsized role in coming up with policy for the federal workforce, are very serious, more serious than they were in the first term. And they feel that they learned a lot from the first term. They feel that many people in government disappointed them, and they want to go after them. That said, I think there's a realization that, you can't really fire half the government because you actually need federal employees to carry out your mission, your agenda. You got elected for a reason. And let's say you want to make the Department of Energy more oil and gas friendly. Well, okay, you need employees to do the really hard work that is not seen by the public of coming up with new oil and gas leases. These there are laws to follow, there are regulations to follow. I mean, you can't just get rid of every federal regulation. The government is too big, and it just doesn't really work that way. The other thing,
although at Twitter, Elon Musk, he clear-cut a vast number of employees with terrible effect for Twitter's value. But there was willingness to do that.
Right. But that's a private company. And the other thing is that many people, I think, have maybe read this op-ed that Ramaswamy and Elon Musk wrote for the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, which they did talk about reducing the federal workforce, but they did not mention, as far as I can tell, Schedule F. And they did not mention these incendiary things that they've talked about firing employees. Instead, what they talked about were something called RIFs, which stand for reduction in force. And this is sort of effectively buyouts, the way the government does it. And I think there are probably people in government, who would be happy to be paid to basically sell their job back to the government. And they did mention that. Now, I think there are laws about RIFs where, you need a reason to do RIFs. But my point is that I just don't think that they're going to find it very easy to just come in and fire people. And even Schedule F does require them to actually have a reason to dismiss people. So I think lawyers representing these employees would have a pretty good case to fight that.
So you've mentioned some stuff about this. A lot of this is going to wind up in court. But looking at it from the employee point of view, from bureaucrats' point of view, government's slow. People analogize it to turning around a battleship. What tactics might people use to slow down a purge or a RIF or sort of whatever mechanism they use to get rid of people or change their jobs?
Yeah, well, a lot of the Biden appointees who are on their way out, I think, have been advising career employees at a lot of agencies to just sort of keep their head down and do their work. So that's part of it. And this now goes back to something we talked about, the effort that's being made for people to sort of have different roles in government. So at a lot of agencies, diversity, equity, and inclusion roles, climate change roles, equal justice roles, a lot of roles that are not really on the Trump administration's agenda are changing. And so there's kind of a race right now to figure out what roles employees could have that would sort of fit in more closely with the agenda. And I have friends who are doing this. I have people I know who work in government who are doing this. So that's really, I think, one thing that's happening. The other thing is that people are very busy applying to other agencies where they feel the mission is fairly neutral from the Trump administration's point of view and where they sort of won't be targeted. The Agriculture Department, for example, is one. The Department of Homeland Security is one. The Transportation Department is another one.
So you go from a dangerous job enforcing climate change regulations to a job handing out highway subsidies that no one's going to object to.
Exactly. I mean, and that could be, for example, the President Biden's, infrastructure law. Well, there's a lot of money that is already spoken for in that law. And once some money has been allocated and spoken for, you can't really go back and cut that. I mean, there's people are worried that future expenditures in the infrastructure law might be stopped, but it's also possible that they would just shift to projects that are more friendly, that the Trump administration cares about more. And so I think employees could just say, okay, I want to get in that kind of a role where I could survive the next 4 years. I mean, these are people who have families, they want to stay in the government, and they don't want to go look for a job in the private sector, for example. And so there's a lot of movement right now among civil servants to try to get themselves to sort of a safe harbor.
So this is less important than keeping your job entirely, but a lot of workers are nervous about the talk of bringing everyone back to the office. As you mentioned, a lot of people around here, they work under union contracts or other rules. Can a new president just snap his fingers and say everyone back to work 5 days a week?
This issue of return to work assumed more urgency when Trump, for the first time, actually addressed it. I think it was at a press conference he held. And he talked about an agency, which happened to be the Social Security Administration, where actually Martin O'Malley, who was Biden's appointee to run Social Security, just before he left inked a deal with the union there, which is a pretty powerful union, to extend telework provisions that are now in place by 5 years. And so Trump was pretty angry about this and said, this isn't right. And anyone who doesn't follow a return to work mandate will be fired. So what I have learned is that this can work a couple of ways. If you are not covered by a union contract, and that basically covers about half of the civil service, and you receive a mandate to come back to work 5 days, you can be called back to work. And if you have no union protections, let's say you're a manager, you actually could be suspended and then fired if you did not follow that mandate. But the thing is that hundreds of thousands of federal employees actually are in jobs that don't have, telework provisions whatsoever. Think of, a VA nurse, a VA doctor at a VA hospital. Think of a TSA officer, right? At airports. I mean, there's so many jobs that fall into this category.
All right. I mean, there's this caricature of it. Everyone's working from home, but in fact, if you're the gate guard someplace,
right,
you can't.
It's really not that many people. But let me just get back to this issue that Trump was raising. So it turns out that most of the big cabinet agencies are right now covered by union contracts. And so technically it is illegal to break those contracts that have a lot of elements to them, but one of which is telework provision. But what we don't know is if the administration will decide, okay, we're going to break that contract and we're just going to call everyone back to work. And what'll happen is that the unions who represent employees at the particular agency, they'll appeal to the Federal Labor Relations Authority, but that could be stacked with Trump appointees. So they may not get very far and the Trump appointees could drag things out. Meanwhile, people would have to come back to work. It looks like it's going to be a bit of a mess. We don't know what the administration will do with union contracts.
But I guess this is the big question is how will Trump or the people around him react? I mean, if we have a spectacle where there's employees they're trying to order back to work who either themselves or through their unions are saying nothing doing, we have a deal, or if they're employees they're trying to fire who are saying nothing doing, I have civil service protections and you can't do this. What will the reaction? I mean, we've seen little things that really sparked off anger in Trump. What will the reaction be if people gamed out this scenario of if this becomes a big public nasty fight?
I know. You're so right. I mean, Michael, I think we don't really know. I mean, we do have some evidence to go on the telework front from the first administration where Trump's agriculture secretary, Sonny Perdue, sometime at the beginning of that administration, which had some telework, he came into the office at headquarters and said, where is everyone? I mean, they weren't working full time, but from home. And so actually he did order people back to the office. This happened also at the education department, which had an expired contract. And the Trump administration at the time didn't want to work with the unions to negotiate a new contract. And so they did impose a return to work and employees did follow it. And years later, in a lot of cases, the unions won with these agencies that had been forced to come back. But the employees did end up coming back. So there'll be a lot of litigation. And I just think that with Schedule F, when people who end up getting let go in that scenario, I think we don't know because this is new territory. This has never happened where someone has been fired after they've been put in a new occupational category. And some people will have attorneys, some people will have unions representing them, some people will just leave. It's unknown terrain. And I think federal employees are right to be really nervous about this. And, I'll be covering it. I just don't know what it's going to look like.
So look, if we were doing this podcast in Detroit or something, and there was talk of a lot of job losses about to come in the auto industry, that would be a thing that the workers obviously were concerned about, and also a lot of their neighbors, because if all your neighbors lose their jobs, your house value is going to take a hit. Obviously, your heart's going to go out to them, and that's sort of the situation in Washington. With the one difference of people have, as you say, very little experience with this, because the deal here was always that you may never rise to big private sector incomes, but you're also pretty safe, and that's changing. People have really I think are like literally don't know what to do. So for people who are nervous, federal employees, et cetera, who are they reaching out to? Who should they be reaching out to?
Right. Well, so it turns out that since the election, a lot of democratically funded organizations have allied themselves and teamed up with federal employee unions to do exactly this, to become sort of an online public resource center for federal employees who have questions, who face who face actions against them, who face firings, who face all kinds of targeting. And there's the resources under the banner Civil Service Strong, which provides a website that has information about employee rights, about options for legal representation, and news about what the group calls ongoing attacks on the civil service. And so this is funded by Democracy Forward and a bunch of unions. There's also a separate federal employee group called the DOJ Gender Equality Network that's very active. And federal employees from a number of agencies are really getting active here. And I think that every week there's going to be a more organized effort to help people.
Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And this will be an ongoing, unfolding discussion.
Lisa and I were chatting a bit more after we stopped recording, and she asked us to tell folks if they work in government and have thoughts or tips, call her. Her number is 202-821-3120, and her email is lisa.rein@washpost.com. That's lisa.rein@washpost.com. Who knows, maybe you'll inspire some reporting that we can talk about in a future CityCast episode. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.